From the studios of KENW on the campus of Eastern New Mexico University, it's You Should Know, featuring the people and events of Eastern New Mexico and West Texas.
Welcome to You Should Know. I'm your host, Evelyn Ledbetter, and today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Brendon Asher as our guest. Dr. Asher, or do I refer to you as Brendon?
You can call me Brendon. That's perfectly fine.
Thank you. We appreciate you coming here.
Happy to be here.
And you are actually the director of the Blackwater Draw Landmark Historical Site. I said that backwards, didn't I? Or did I get that right?
That's all right. The Blackwater Draw National Historic Landmark Archaeological Site. It's a long title.
And we were talking, there's several different things that it goes by.
Yes. So a lot of folks know it just as the Clovis site.
Okay.
Which we'll talk about why it got that name in a little bit.
And Blackwater Draw and...
Blackwater Draw, the gravel pit.
Right,
right. Sam Sanders gravel pit. The locals in Portales would probably be familiar with that name.
Well, and as I shared with you, some of my buddies growing up, they did go out there and ride dirt bikes and things like that. It was a gravel pit.
Yep, absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about your background.
I grew up in Kansas, north of Kansas City, about an hour, in a small town called Atchison, which is kind of historically famous for the Atchison-Topeka-Santa Fe Railroad. And also it's the birthplace of Amelia Earhart, so that's one of our other claims to fame. But from a very young age, I got interested in archaeology because in that area, there's a lot of archaeological sites. And I grew up in the country, and as a young kid, probably 7 or 8 years old, started finding artifacts, just basically in my own backyard. Mm-hmm. And that got me interested, and I wanted to learn more about them. So I knew from very early I wanted to study archaeology, and I wanted to become an archaeologist. And I even did my first archaeological field school when I was in high school, which usually you don't hear about that much.
No, you don't.
Usually it's once you're in college and you kind of figure out what you want to do, then you do the archaeological field school. But after high school, I went to the University of Kansas. And I tell all my friends I stayed there too long. Ended up receiving a PhD in anthropology, focusing on archaeology in 2015, and kind of did some independent contracting, consulting work for a couple years with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And then I heard about a position open up here in Portales.
Well, lucky for us.
Yeah, with the Blackwater Draw site. And it was very quick. I saw an advertisement on Facebook from a colleague that was a previous professor at ENMU, and I applied for the job. That was in July, I believe, and then by August of 2017, I was living in Portales. Yeah.
In Kansas, you normally think of wheat fields and pheasant hunting and things like that, but I did not realize that it had an archaeological foundation
it's
as well.
Very, very rich archaeological background in Kansas, including Clovis spear points. We've documented probably about 130 Clovis spear points throughout the state of Kansas.
Area.
Yeah.
That's fun. I know my kids, that was a big deal, was looking at rocks, and we've hunted arrowheads and things just after big sandstorms. You could go out and find them, and something common in a lot of different areas here in New Mexico as well.
Absolutely.
And I guess when you look at doing archaeological, you try to find a way to make money on that, of making a living, typically either teaching or trying to get grants or things through a university. Is that the main ways?
There's two main kind of trajectories with archaeology. One of them is the academic side. And you do depend on grant funding and raising money from private donors and so forth. The other side is what we call CRM, which is Cultural Resource Management. And those are individuals that get hired by engineering companies to go out and do archaeological surveys before major construction projects. And they actually account for probably over 90% of archaeology that's done in the United States today.
You know, when I worked at a telephone company, and when they were laying fiber between Portales and Clovis, I do remember that we had to have that survey done before they could trench or do anything.
Right. Yep.
And so I knew we paid people, but I didn't think about that being obviously a career path as well.
Sure.
But probably not as interesting as what you landed in.
Well, it's pretty cool, and there's a pretty long, interesting past associated with Blackwater Draw, going back over 90 years.
Wow. Wow, tell us a little bit about that history.
Okay, so the site was discovered in 1929 by James Ridgely Whiteman. He was a young rancher out of Portales. He was 19 years old. And the late 1920s, early 1930s, we're entering into the Dust Bowl. Right. So there's a lot of erosion. You were talking about the sand blowing around. People in this part of the world are very familiar with that, the dust storms that we get. And he was out walking around at today what is the Blackwater Draw Archaeological Site, and he was finding human-made artifacts with what he called elephant bones, which today we recognize as Columbian mammoth. And he sends letters to the Smithsonian trying to get them interested to send out an archaeologist to observe this site. And unfortunately, nobody really listens. And it wasn't until 1932 that an archaeologist would finally visit.
Well, and I guess with the stock market crash and things happening in 1929, that probably wasn't real high on people's list.
It wasn't a priority.
It wasn't a concern at that point, just of surviving. And of course, like you said, the Dust Bowl days, agriculture and things here were almost impossible.
Yeah.
So it just kind of sat there for a while and no interest happened. So what finally got some traction to get it going?
So there was a couple other discoveries that happened in North America. One of them occurred actually in 1908, and it's what we call the Folsom Site, which was also in New Mexico. And it was discovered by George McJunkin, a rancher. He was out checking fence lines after a heavy rain, kind of a late summer in August rain. And he looked down in a ditch and he saw very large bones that he recognized. He was a rancher. He was a rodeo guy, and he knew they weren't modern cattle. And he recognized them as bison, and probably prehistoric bison, so an extinct species. And he, kind of like Ridgely, he tried to get people interested. And nobody really listened. Nobody followed up. And he passed away in 1922. And finally, in 1926, an archaeologist by the name of Jesse Figgins came down from Denver and visited George McJunkin's discovery and recognized this is pretty significant. And they started excavating there, and they discovered today what we call Folsom spear points, which is the little spear point here on the table. And they were found with bison bones that are over 10,000 years old. So that caused kind of a critical rethinking in North American archaeology that people were here 10,000 years or longer.
Right.
And the previous thought was maybe they've been here for about 6,000.
So it really reset that timeline.
Yeah. And that's just 2 years before Ridgely's out of Blackwater Draw. So he knew about the Folsom discovery. And that's why he knew he had something that was important. And finally, in 1932, Edgar Howard comes out from Pennsylvania. He was kind of a non-traditional grad student. He went back to school later in life. And he decided, I'm going to look for early humans in the New World. And one of the places he thought we would find them was in caves. And you might be thinking, there's no caves around here.
Not many.
Right.
Maybe some dirt overhangs and things like that. But
so he started working actually in the Guadalupe Mountains down around Carlsbad. And that started 1929, the same year Ridgely Whiteman was up here.
So all this is coming together.
Yes. And he started talking to a journalist out of Carlsbad by the last name of Anderson that bought up a bunch of land in Roosevelt County. And he was kind of thinking this could be a money opportunity because there was an investment opportunity. They were starting to build Cannon Air Force Base. So he saw an opportunity there. So he buys a bunch of property in Roosevelt County, and he was friends with Edgar Howard from working down in Carlsbad, and it's Anderson that ends up meeting up with Ridgely Whiteman, and then just through word of mouth, that's how Edgar Howard finally ends up in 1932 at Blackwater Draw.
And the crazy, how the stories, truly newspapers were your source of news. It wasn't like today where you could look, or so common you couldn't tie people together.
Yes.
So,
yeah. And ironically, Howard visits in August of 1932, and he confirms Ridgely Whiteman has something important here. And he basically says, I'm going to dedicate the next several years of field work to researching this site. And he goes back to Pennsylvania. And in November of that year, the mineral rights to the property changes hands. And the New Mexico Department of Transportation obtains the rights for the sand and gravel.
Oh.
And we talked about a gravel pit, they started gravel mining. And Edgar Howard, he hears about this back in Pennsylvania, and he comes back out. And he documents in the trench that they had dug to get the sand and gravel, an extensive bone deposit. And he sends off a telegram that gets intercepted by the journal Science. And it literally, that's what puts us on the map. In November of 1932, Howard's telegram saying extensive bone deposit about 14 miles south of Clovis. And he was going to tie up permissions and conduct field work there.
And did that get started, or did the state go ahead and, I guess they continued using the gravel out of that?
They did. And Howard, he was true to his word. He started working the next season, and he continued to work all the way through 1936 and 1937 at Blackwater Draw. And two of the Clovis spear points he found, which today are what we call the type specimens. It's what the technology's been defined after in the academic literature. He found those in 1936. So it took a few years before he actually found Clovis spear points in place with a mammoth skeleton. And that was significant because it was the first time in North America, unequivocally, that it demonstrated human-made spear points with mammoth bones that were down deeper. They were lower than the Folsom artifacts found with bison that were up higher.
On the surface.
So now all of a sudden, we're thinking humans have been here longer than Folsom. And they still didn't know how much longer, but they knew they had something earlier.
Wow. So tying that man was here much earlier, and to at this point, I've read 13,000. Is that the timeline of where they feel that?
Yep, that's calendar years. 13,500. It's kind of on the earlier end of Clovis.
And at that point, when that was discovered, was that the earliest finding of humans in North America?
It was, yeah, that had been demonstrated. And what was interesting about that and significant is that Clovis artifacts named after town of Clovis, they're found from Canada all the way down to Costa Rica and almost every state in between.
So Portales almost could have had that.
Yes, yeah. And there is actually some other artifacts that were found that were called the Portales complex. They were all found out at Blackwater Draw, but they're a later style of projectile point.
And I know you said, the gravel, the significance, roads weren't out here.
Right.
So for him to get here from Pennsylvania, railroads weren't even here yet, right?
Yep. So yeah, that's pretty incredible in its own.
I guess a horse ride?
Yeah, well, there's some old photographs that have really old model vehicles in the background. So they were driving, but it would have been a tough...
But not roads.
No roads. That's why they were getting the sand and gravel. And there's stories I've heard about people finding artifacts in their driveways.
Because of the gravel. Because of the gravel
Portales,
that was used for the paving.
because it came out of that gravel pit. And that became a commercial gravel mine in the 1950s with Sam Sanders. So the mineral rights changed hands again. And Sam Sanders started an extensive gravel mining operation where he was removing 100 to 200 cubic yards of sand and gravel every single day. And to get to the sand and gravel, you had to go through the archaeological deposits up above. So
a lot of things were destroyed.
A couple football fields of archaeology that's being destroyed every day.
And there was no way at that point, that wasn't of importance that was higher than the building of roads to say, no, we're going to stop this. This is a significant find in history.
Sure.
That wasn't the way that worked.
The scientists recognized it as significant, and Sam Sanders did too. And he allowed scientists, archaeologists to come in and excavate and research, but it was very much in a salvage fashion, so very quick, because they didn't want to slow up the gravel mining activity.
So it was not to find something in the source where it was deposited. It was just you sifted through things after it was dug out? Is that how it works?
Usually
or?
what would happen is they'd be running their bulldozers over the surface, and then they'd hit like a big bone.
And they would stop.
And then they'd stop, and archaeologists would come in and excavate. And that happened quite a bit in the 1960s. And there's one area of the site where 5 mammoth skeletons were discovered. And with those 5 skeletons, there was on the order of 130 stone artifacts with them.
Huh.
So pretty compelling evidence that humans 13,000 years ago at Blackwater Draw were actually hunting mammoth and butchering mammoth. There's been a long-standing debate. Were they ever actually hunting a mammoth, or were they just scavenging ones that had died naturally? And we have pretty compelling evidence now from a number of sites, including Blackwater Draw, that they were actually hunting them.
That's interesting, because when you take, do you have a point? Is there a point here that would be able to, a mammoth is huge, to try to puncture through that tough skin?
Yes.
How in the world did they do that?
So these 2 examples, the larger spear points, are both found at Blackwater Draw, and they are both Clovis points. You can see they're quite a bit bigger than that Folsom artifact. And a lot of people for a long time, they argued to hunt a big animal, you need a big spear point. And that's not really true. And the other question I get asked a lot is, how many spear points do you need? Well, the answer is 1.
In the right
right spot.
In the right spot.
So what these people probably did was they'd hunt a cow-calf herd, so a matriarch herd of mammoth. That's typically the animals we see at these sites. It's not the bulls, which are much more aggressive. And they'll isolate one of the individuals from that herd, successfully try to spear it, and then you probably just track it. And however long that takes, maybe a day, maybe a couple days. If mammoth are anything like modern elephants, they look for a water source to die. And Blackwater Draw was a spring-fed lake. So that's attracting the mammoth into that area. And then humans, all you have to do is just follow them there.
You know what you're talking about? My daughter did, and my son too, compound bow shooting. And you aimed for those major organs.
Right.
And that would take a big animal down.
Sure. Yeah, and there's a site in southern Arizona. It's a single mammoth that had 8 spear points, 8 Clovis spear points in the body, and it was never butchered. So it looks like
didn't get it tracked down.
It's one that got away. Yeah.
Wow. And of course, the food I would guess jerky or some sort of drying of the meat.
Sure.
There's no way to preserve that long term, or to not enough people to eat it at once. So you've got to preserve it.
So probably cutting it into thin strips and air drying, making jerky. You can then take that and mix it with berries and other plants and pound it all together and make pemmican, which is highly nutritious, basically jerky, that it can last preserved for several months. And
then, of course, hides and things for shelter, clothing, everything.
Yeah.
Tendons, was that part?
Sewing
on that.
And they're also using the bone. So when the bone is fresh, it'll flake just like stone will. So they're making artifacts out of the bone as well. That's fascinating.
And so obviously climate has had a tremendous impact over time. To think of, if the mammoths, they eat herbivores, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there had to be a lot of plantation here.
Yeah, very different than today.
And then, of course, the water source.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So 13,000 years ago, there was about an 80-acre lake where Blackwater Draw is today. And within the boundaries of that lake, so far we found the remains of 28 mammoth. There's probably more, we just haven't found them. And that flowed to the south. So there was an outlet channel, and it drained into Blackwater Draw, which today is a dry draw.
Mm-hmm.
And that tributary, it drains to the east, southeast to Lubbock, Texas.
Right.
And it meets up with the Yellow House Draw, and it becomes the Brazos River.
Right.
So prehistorically, when there was water in those tributaries, that would have been a major route of travel. And what's interesting is if you keep following those stream systems to central Texas, you end up at an outcrop of what's called Edwards Chert, which is a high-quality stone that almost all of these artifacts except for this one, are made out of. So those people brought stone with them 13,000 years ago from Central Texas.
That's fascinating.
And carried it all the way to Blackwater Draw. And we see that repeatedly with sites of this age. They're seeking out a high quality stone that's not local, and they're bringing it in with them. And the one artifact that is not Edwards, this one, is obsidian, as even when we were talking earlier, you noticed that. And it's actually been sourced to Utah. So they're bringing stone in all the way from Utah.
Well, people were nomad, right? They traveled, they followed the food.
Yep, highly mobile.
That's fascinating. And I had read where this was the headwaters, right, of the Brazos.
Yeah.
And you look at it now and you go, I don't understand that.
Oh, yeah.
But
That's
there
just
actually
dry
was.
now.
So, but when you go back 13,000 years, a whole different world.
And the other thing that they're doing, they knew the landscape very well, which tells us they had probably been here for much longer than maybe we give them credit for. They knew that at Blackwater Draw, there is no local stone available to make your artifacts out of. So they're bringing in what we call caches, stockpiles of, in this case, Edwards Chert, and all the artifacts on your side of the table. Yeah. They were found in a bundle, in a grouping in the 1990s out at Blackwater Draw. And they're what we call blades, which are essentially knives. So you can process plants, cut grasses, you can cut up meat and tendon and sinew and hide. And they're bringing that stone in with them, and they're storing it here because they knew there's no stone here.
Right. So let's have it here when we need it.
Yes. And we've had 2 caches found. That's one of them from Blackwater Draw.
That's fascinating.
And what that tells us is these people knew the land very well, and they planned to return. So they saw Blackwater Draw as a locality that if we can kind of provision it with the resources that aren't there, the stone, it has everything else we need. It has the water, it has the animals coming in.
So when you're traveling, when you're kind of planning out your year, you kind of tend to go with weather, and you know I can come back here and there's a food source there.
Yeah, and it's probably seasonal.
That's fascinating. Wow. So the Blackwater site, is there times, I mean, I know there's a closure over the building, and the dig sites are there. For people to go out there and view that, is there time frames or times they can look at that?
Absolutely, yes. And we do have what we call the Interpretive Center, which is the metal structure, and it's covering one of the few areas in North America where you have an ongoing, active archaeological dig that has basically the sequence of humans stretching from Sam Sanders gravel pit times, from historic times, all the way back 13,000 years ago. And it is open to the public.
Okay.
It's seasonal, and we're open in the spring for April and May, and only on the weekends, though. Okay. So Saturday and Sunday from 9 to 4. And then starting in June, our summer hours, we're open 9 to 4, Thursday through Sunday, through August.
But of course, is that on Eastern's website through the Blackwater Draw?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And there's a museum as well, right?
Yes, and the museum on campus, it's open Thursday through Sunday all year.
This is really like a hidden gem. We should have big, huge signs out on I think there used to be a big, one of your billboards out on the side that had a big mammoth on that.
Yep.
We need to get those back up.
We do.
Because
Absolutely.
For kids like you, that would have drawn you in a heartbeat.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the irony, the first time I visited Blackwater Draw was 2010. I had a conference in Perryton, Texas, and I decided I'm close enough, I'm going to go see it. And this was before the time of everything being on your phone. It was a Monday. I get out there and the site's closed. So my very first time here, I have a picture of the gate and the sign out on the highway. And
that's all you could do?
And that's all I got.
And you're respectful enough, you didn't climb over the gate and go in.
Yep.
Oh, and then also I know you have a couple of activities, right, of a year?
We do. So we have what's called Hands-On History Day in the spring. Usually it's in April or May. And then in the fall, usually the last weekend of October, we have an annual atlatl competition. So you get the opportunity to go out and use a prehistoric spear thrower and compete with other people for prizes.
How cool is that? Wow. So just such a huge resource, and just fascinating that I've learned a lot today, and I know other people have. I know there's a video that you've done that's a pretty extensive one online as well that talks about the site, and you give some tours and show the different stratas and
Yes,
things on
and
there.
there is a link to that on the Blackwater Draw website,
Okay.
which is bwdarchaeology.com.
Okay,
And you can also find our hours for the museum and the site on there as well.
very nice. I'm guessing you give a lot of school tours and different things like that as well.
We do. Yeah, and even though the site might be closed, if you schedule a tour with us, we're always happy to let you in and
Okay.
provide a tour.
So if you had known that back in the day, you somehow could have worked your way
could
in
have
when you
called ahead, yeah.
right,
Yep.
and got to see it right
Right.
then. Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for sharing this information with us, and thank you for your hard work.
No problem. Thank
All
you,
right,
Evelyn.
thank you, Brendon. And for all of you watching today, we will see you next time. Cheers.